1. The last flight out. On April 29, 1975, at 4 a.m., 4 massive Chinook transport helicopters were parked in parallel in front of the civil aviation terminal of Tan Son Nhut Airport, Vietnam. Nam's crew had taken refuge there the previous day, April 28, because several South Vietnamese pilots who defected and allied with the Viet Cong had commandeered a few aircraft from the Republic of Vietnam Air Force to bomb the airfield, further intensifying the chaos and terror among the people of Saigon. The fate of Nam's 237th Airborne Battalion was tied to the destiny of South Vietnam. All members of the flight crew were visibly anxious, awaiting Nam's decision, but he hesitated, hoping that the commanding officer of Loi Tan's squadron would join them before making any final decisions. A few days before, on April 27th, the 237th Battalion had been ordered to move from their base in Bien Hoa to Tan Son Nhut, leaving the commanding officer behind to coordinate operations with Brigadier General T, commander of the 3rd Air Division, and Colonel T, commander of the 43rd Tactical Air Wing. Meanwhile, Nam was assigned to command the establishment of an air bridge between Bien Hoa and Tan Son Nhut. At this time, the staff officers of the battalion were notably absent after hearing the news of the bombing of the airfield. The afternoon of April 28 was a time of extreme tension, as if they were sitting in a boiling cauldron. Nam noticed several transport planes, including C-130s, C-47s, and C-119s, taking off one by one, carrying the families of senior officers of the Air Force Command to Thailand or Con Sun Island. Many of the remaining officers and non-commissioned officers clung to Nam as if he were their last lifeline. After ensuring that the aircraft was in good operational condition and fully refueled, Nam organized 4 flight crews, consisting of himself, Captain S, Lieutenant Q, Lieutenant K, and other aircrew members. Weapons were hidden on board, ready for use if necessary. Nam issued a password for everyone and assigned them to guard duty to prevent any sabotage by enemy commandos in the night. That night, everyone slept under the aircraft, waiting for any new information from the Air Force Command. Nam had not had a chance to bathe for 3 days, as after sending his wife and children to stay with family in Phu Lam, a small province in Saigon, he lived in the battalion, strictly confined to the base like all the other men. Some officers informed Nam that they had seen the families of the wing commander, deputy wing commander, and other tactical wing commanders busy evacuating their wives and children out of Vietnam. Occasionally, Nam had asked the commanding officer of Loi Tan's squadron about the evacuation plan, but he only vaguely knew that they were waiting for orders from above. Nam understood that in this critical situation, the commanders of the divisions, wings, and senior staff officers of the Air Force Command had kept the information secret to avoid causing panic among their subordinates. Nam advised his crew to sleep on the concrete floor under the aircraft. If the enemy attacked, they would have a better chance of survival and a wider field of vision to counterattack effectively. In the early evening, Nam noticed many transport aircraft of the Republic of Vietnam Air Force taking off, full of people, heading south. He didn't pay much attention to this. Occasionally, a few foreign civilian aircraft landed and parked next to the Chinooks. The passengers were mostly civilians, well-dressed. Nam thought they were probably the wives of government officials or the families of South Vietnamese elites heading to Thailand. In these extremely difficult moments, Nam couldn't be sure if the members of his crew shared the same goals, as he suspected that the Viet Cong might have compromised some of them. He silently observed their behavior and encouraged them to wait for orders from their superiors. After several sleepless nights coupled with endless worries, Nam eventually fell asleep without realizing it. The sound of a 122mm rocket exploding nearby jolted everyone awake. Nam saw that the southern end of the runway was ablaze, likely from a hit on a fuel depot. It was around 3:30 a.m. on April 29, 1975. The Viet Cong were concentrating their firepower on the airfield, with explosions echoing continuously. The sound of enemy 130mm artillery, combined with the howling of 122mm rockets, created an eerie, terrifying atmosphere. The airfield was nearly paralyzed, as Nam didn't hear or see any fighter planes taking off to strike back at the enemy's artillery positions. Nam called all 4 flight crews together, instructing them to be ready to take off when they saw the first aircraft start its engines. The men were anxious, eagerly waiting for news from the Air Force Command through the Paris frequency. As an officer standing on the edge of history during a period of national turmoil, Nam remained absolutely committed to military discipline, placing himself under the command of his superiors. Like a knight with a horse helicopter at his disposal, he could flee at any moment but chose not to, as he wasn't a deserter fleeing his responsibilities. His duty as a commander didn't allow him to do so. With the commanding officer absent, Nam was the commander of his unit, and the remaining officers and non-commissioned officers saw him as their final hope in this almost hopeless situation. At around 4 a.m., Nam received news from the airport security radio that the Viet Cong were attacking and had breached the northwest perimeter of the airfield, not far from where the helicopters were parked. Nam realized that staying any longer would be futile. He ordered all crews to start their engines and head towards Vung Tau airfield. He believed that being close to the coast, Vung Tau might be less susceptible to enemy artillery fire. Nam led first, only to discover that Captain S's helicopter had an engine malfunction and couldn't start. Nam turned back to pick up the crew, but just then, Captain S's aircraft managed to start its engines. All 4 helicopters headed towards Vung Tau, with the sky still dark. Nam noticed flashes of light around the airfield, likely enemy artillery firing at the airport. The formation climbed to about 3,000 feet, looking down at Saigon, where many small fires were burning. Glancing back at Tan Son Nhut Airport, he saw that the fuel tanks were engulfed in flames, lighting up the sky. As they approached the Vung Tau naval base, the formation was warned to keep their distance, as the Navy was firing at aircraft from their ships. Nam instructed his men to turn off the navigation lights, to avoid detection from the ground. Before long, all 4 helicopters landed safely at the refueling station designated for helicopters. Nam instructed everyone to move the helicopters to a nearby empty field and shut down the engines to listen for any updates from Saigon, giving them time to take care of personal matters. Nam took the opportunity to change out of his flight suit, which he had been wearing for 3 days. Just as he finished changing and was about to put on his shoes, a sudden boom boom echoed through the air as the Viet Cong began shelling their location again. Everyone quickly started their engines and took off, with Nam ordering them to head towards Can Tho. Once the helicopters were airborne, Nam tried to contact the Paris frequency one last time but received no orders. Nam thought, "That's it then, we are on our own." A minute later, Nam called the formation to check their positions. Big Eagle 1 here, calling 2, 3 and 4. Report your position. 2 here to your right, 1 mile away, over. 1 copies, 5/5 3, report your position. 4 here. 4 copies, 5/5. It seemed that Big Eagle 3 had separated from the formation during takeoff from Vung Tau. Nam remained silent in the cockpit, realizing that yet another member of the formation had gone off on their own without a final word of farewell or goodbye. At that moment, Nam didn't have time to be angry or blame anyone for their actions. The aircraft was government property, but at this dire moment, it belonged to the men in the cockpit. They could use it however they saw fit, even though Nam was their direct commander. The reality was that at this point, all that was left was the camaraderie of brothers in arms, as Nam's superiors had all either fled or gone into hiding. Big Eagle 1, this is 2, calling. 1 here, 5/5. Requesting permission to land at My Toe Lake to say goodbye to my family, over. Permission granted. Be careful when landing, the area is small. 2 and 4, do you copy? 2 copies, 5/5. 4 copies, 5/5. Flying at a low altitude, Nam noticed that My Toe was completely calm. The market was bustling with shoppers, showing no signs of disorder or war. He ordered the 3 Chinooks to land, taking up almost the entire lakefront. After shutting down the engines Everyone felt a sense of relief, as it seemed there was no sign of bombing or chaos here, and the locals were probably unaware of what had happened in Saigon. While Captain S went to visit his family in the city, Nam discussed with his men whether they should stay there instead of continuing to Can Tho, further south, and everyone agreed. Lieutenant K was tasked with flying to Dong Tam airfield to get more fuel for the 3 helicopters. At this time it seemed that most of the crew members were still single, except for Nam and Captain S, who both had families. Nam's wife and 3 children were still temporarily staying in Phu Lam, so he decided to return to pick them up and take them wherever they could. At around 9:30 a.m. on April 29, 1975, after giving instructions to his men to wait for him until around 11 a.m. if possible, Nam and Sergeant C, Sergeant M, and the gunner took off, heading back to Phu Lam. The weather in southern Vietnam at this time of year was often cloudy, with low cloud cover. Nam knew that the communists had placed anti-aircraft guns near the outskirts of the city in the Bin Tri area to shoot down planes approaching the airport, so he flew above the clouds to avoid anti-aircraft fire and SAM-7 missiles. About 15 minutes later, he spotted Tan Son Nhut Airport, still shrouded in smoke and fire. Descending through the clouds, Nam saw his house below. Circling low, he saw his wife, children, and in-laws running out into the yard looking up. Nam waved and landed in the empty playfield in front of the house. Sergeant C opened the rear door of the Chinook and ran out to help Nam's wife, children, and 2 adopted nieces on board. By this time, curious onlookers had crowded around to see what was happening. Police cars, sirens blaring, also rushed to the scene, seemingly unaware of what had happened. Within 3 minutes, Sergeant C reported, "All clear, ramp up, ready for takeoff." Nam took off with full power, and the massive aircraft, like a wild stallion, gracefully leapt into the sky, leaving behind a terrifying whirlwind. Later, Nam's mother would tell him that the helicopter's takeoff had caused the collapse of a house behind theirs, and they had to pay to rebuild it. In a short time, Nam had climbed above the clouds again, just as the red light indicating a malfunction in engine number 2 came on. Normally, this would require finding a place to land as soon as possible, but at that moment it was impossible. Nam knew that the area below was Bin Chan, likely filled with Viet Cong guerrillas advancing toward Saigon. However, Nam was confident in his ability to fly the helicopter to safety. To his left, not far away, Nam saw a Huey helicopter flying towards Mai Tho. He opened the emergency frequency to request an escort in case of an emergency landing, but received no response. Despite everything, the flight proceeded smoothly, and the helicopter landed safely at Mai Tho Lake, where the crew was still waiting. They were overjoyed to see Nam return on time. By 11 a.m., Nam had given the flight crew a sum of money, both from the battalion's funds, which Lieutenant L had handed over the day before, and from what his wife had brought along. He sent the men off to have lunch and enjoy a final day with friends and family in Mai Tho. Nam sat with his wife feeding their children. The youngest of them was Mina, a daughter just 8 months old, while Mika, their son, was 3, and Mickey, their eldest, was 7. At that moment, the men brought an elderly man over 60 years old to Nam. He introduced himself as the father of Brigadier General T, commander of the 3rd Air Division in Bien Hoa. He asked Nam for a ride to Saigon if they were flying back, explaining that the roads between Saigon and Mai Tho had been cut off by the Viet Cong. Nam explained that they were all fleeing from Saigon and hadn't yet decided where to go in the coming hours. Hearing this, the old man shook his head in disappointment. "If that's the case, please take me wherever you're going." "Sure, just wait here," Nam replied. Nam reviewed the map and discussed with his men that they couldn't stay there overnight due to the insecurity and dangers, as the communists could attack at any time. It was better to find an island off the coast to spend the night while waiting for news from Saigon. There were plenty of weapons and ammunition on board, so the crew could hold out if necessary, and everyone seemed to agree with this plan. Nam asked the driver of the old man's Toyota to take him into town to buy provisions. He purchased 2 100-kilogram sacks of rice, several kilograms of sugar, a dozen bottles of fish sauce, and some dried snakehead fish, as well as cooking utensils. These supplies were intended to sustain them for a while as they waited. We hope you enjoyed the excerpt from this chapter. The complete audiobook of The Last Flight Out by Nguyen Van Ba can be purchased on platforms like Google Play and others. Please subscribe to this channel for more content like this.